Hello, everyone. Welcome back to LGBT Stories, where we dive into emotional, romantic, and sometimes heart-wrenching tales that explore love in all its forms. Today, we have a story that will leave you both intrigued and moved. Imagine this. It's the middle of the night, and you're fast asleep, completely unaware of what's about to unfold. But then suddenly, you wake up to find your nephew standing at the edge of your bed, his eyes filled with vulnerability and a truth that neither of you can ignore. This isn't just any story. It's a journey of self-discovery, acceptance, and the power of connection. Are you ready? Let's dive into My Nephew Enter My Room in the Dead of Night, a heartfelt gay love story. The night my nephew came into my room while I was sleeping was one of the craziest yet most exciting nights of my life. I remember it so vividly. The house was quiet that night, the kind of stillness that settled deep into the walls and made even the smallest sound echo like a secret waiting to be uncovered. I had gone to bed early, the weight of a long day pulling me under the soft embrace of my blankets. The hum of the ceiling fan and the faint rustle of the curtains in the evening breeze were the only companions to my drifting thoughts as sleep claimed me. It was the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that you sink into after a particularly exhausting day, where time seems to blur and the world outside your closed eyes ceases to exist. I didn't hear the faint creak of the floorboards outside my door or the hesitant turn of the doorknob. When I opened my eyes, it wasn't to the soft glow of morning light filtering through the curtains. Instead, it was the faint outline of a figure standing at the edge of my bed. My heart stuttered in my chest, a jolt of adrenaline coursing through me as I blinked away the remnants of sleep, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Nephew," I said, my voice hoarse and heavy with sleep. He stood there, his silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of the hallway light spilling into the room. His shoulders were tense, his hands fidgeting at his sides, as though he were unsure of whether to stay or retreat. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. I sat up, pushing the blankets aside as I rubbed the sleep from my eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked, concern tightening my chest. It wasn't like him to come into my room at night, let alone look so uneasy. He hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as he avoided my gaze. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted after a moment, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Uncertainty, maybe, or something deeper. I frowned, my concern deepening. "Is everything okay? Did something happen?" He shook his head quickly, his movements almost frantic. "No, it's not that. He trailed off, his gaze finally meeting mine. There was something in his eyes that made my breath catch, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before, something raw and unguarded that left me feeling unsteady. "It's late," I said gently, trying to ease the tension in the air. "Come sit down and tell me what's on your mind." He hesitated for a moment longer before finally crossing the room, his steps tentative as though he were afraid of breaking the fragile quiet that surrounded us. He sat on the edge of the bed, his posture stiff and guarded, and I could see the faint tremor in his hands as he clasped them together. "You're not bothering me," I replied softly, my gaze steady as I tried to read the emotions flickering across his face. "If something's on your mind, I want to help." He let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping slightly as though the weight of whatever he was carrying was too much to bear. I've been feeling so out of place lately," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "Like I don't belong anywhere." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I felt a pang of guilt for not noticing sooner. "Nephew," I said softly, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You're not alone. You have people who care about you, who want to support you." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something I couldn't quite name. "It doesn't feel that way sometimes," he said quietly, the vulnerability in his voice making my heart ache. I tightened my grip on his arm slightly, hoping to offer some semblance of comfort. "I'm here for you," I said firmly. "Whatever you're going through, you don't have to face it alone." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the ceiling fan. His gaze lingered on mine, and I could see the conflict in his expression, the way he seemed to be wrestling with something he couldn't quite bring himself to say. I don't know how to explain it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," I replied gently. "Take your time." He nodded, his posture relaxing ever so slightly as he leaned back against the headboard. The tension in his shoulders seemed to ease, but the weight in his eyes remained. I wanted to say more to offer him some kind of reassurance, but I wasn't sure what he needed or if he even knew himself. "Do you ever feel like you're not enough?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. His question caught me off guard, and I hesitated for a moment before responding. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes," I admitted, "but you are enough, more than enough." He looked at me then, his gaze steady and searching, and for a moment I felt as though he were seeing right through me. "Thanks," he said softly, his lips curving into a faint bittersweet smile. "You don't have to thank me," I said, my own voice quiet. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken thoughts and emotions. I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, the quiet hum of the fan filling the room as the night stretched on. "Do you want to talk more about what's been bothering you?" I asked after a while, my tone gentle. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands before he shook his head. "Maybe another time," he said softly. I nodded, reaching out to squeeze his arm reassuringly. "Whenever you're ready, I'm here." "Thanks," he said again, his voice barely audible as he stood to leave. I felt a strange mix of emotions swirling within me. Concern, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name. All of a sudden, I was quite attracted to him. He was a very handsome young man. I watched as he crossed the room, his footsteps quiet against the carpet, and slipped out the door. The quiet of the night returned, but the air felt heavier now, as though the weight of our conversation had seeped into the walls. I lay back against the pillows, my mind racing as I replayed the moment over and over again. Whatever was troubling him, it wasn't something that could be solved in one conversation, but I was determined to be there for him no matter what. And as I drifted back into a restless sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The next morning arrived with a soft golden glow seeping through the curtains, but I still felt the weight of the night before. Sleep had come in restless fits, and my mind was heavy with thoughts of him, his words, his demeanor, the vulnerability in his voice that had left me feeling both protective and deeply unsettled. As I shuffled into the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee greeted me, and I realized he was already awake. He stood by the counter, his back to me, wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants that hung loosely on his frame. His movements were slow, almost deliberate, as he poured a cup of coffee and stirred it absent-mindedly. "Morning," I said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Morning," he replied, his voice quiet. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching him carefully. There was something different about him this morning. He seemed calmer, but the shadow of whatever had been troubling him still lingered in his eyes. "Did you sleep okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "Not really," he admitted, "but I'm used to that." His response made my chest tighten, and I felt a surge of guilt for not realizing sooner how much he'd been struggling. "You know," I began cautiously, "if there's ever anything you need to talk about, I'm always here." He looked at me over the rim of his mug, his gaze thoughtful. "I know," he said after a moment, "and I appreciate that." We fell into a comfortable silence, the sound of the coffee maker and the faint chirping of birds outside filling the space between us. I wanted to ask more, to dig deeper into whatever was weighing on him, but I didn't want to push. He had always been private, and I knew better than to force him to open up before he was ready. As the morning wore on, he seemed to relax slightly, and I found myself feeling a bit more at ease. We spent the day together in the way we often did, quietly sharing the same space without needing to fill it with constant conversation. It was one of the things I appreciated most about our bond, the unspoken understanding that sometimes just being there was enough. But even as the day passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. The memory of him standing at the foot of my bed the night before, his voice trembling as he admitted his feelings of inadequacy, lingered in the back of my mind like a ghost. Later that evening, after dinner, he retreated to his room, and I found myself wandering through the house, unable to settle the quiet that had felt comforting during the day, but now seemed oppressive, pressing down on me with an intensity one couldn't ignore. Eventually, I found myself standing outside his door, my hand hovering over the wood as I debated whether to knock. Before I could make a decision, the door opened, and he stood there, his expression surprised, but not unwelcoming. "Hey," he said, stepping back to let me in. "What's up?" I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. His room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting warm light over the neatly made bed and the scattered books and papers on his desk. "I just wanted to check in," I said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You seemed off last night. I wanted to make sure you're okay." He closed the door and leaned against it, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked at me for a long moment as though deciding whether to speak. "I've just been thinking a lot," he admitted finally, about what I prompted gently. He let out a soft sigh, running a hand through his hair. "About everything," he said vaguely, his gaze dropping to the floor. "About who I am, what I want, what I'm feeling." His words were heavy, and I could feel the weight of them in the air between us. I waited, giving him the space to continue if he wanted to, but he seemed hesitant to say more. "You don't have to go through this alone," I said softly, my tone steady but firm. "Whatever you're feeling, you can share it with me." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and something deep, something I couldn't quite name. "It's not that easy," he said quietly. "I don't even know how to put it into words. Start wherever you feel comfortable," I encouraged, reaching out to place a hand on his arm. "There's no rush." He hesitated for a moment before pushing off the door and crossing the room to sit beside me on the bed. His movements were slow, almost tentative, and I could see the conflict etched into his features as he struggled to find the right words. "I've just been feeling confused," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like there's this part of me that I don't understand, and it scares me." His admission made my heart ache, and I tightened my grip on his arm slightly, hoping to offer some comfort. "It's okay to feel that way," I said softly. "Confusion is part of figuring things out. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you." He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands, which were clasped tightly in his lap. "It's just hard," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I know," I said gently, "but you don't have to face it alone." He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine as though looking for reassurance. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to thank me," I replied, my own voice steady. The silence between us was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt full, charged with unspoken emotions that neither of us seemed ready to confront. As the minutes stretched on, I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, the steady rise and fall of his breath, the quiet hum of the lamp casting a soft glow over the room. In that moment, I realized that whatever he was going through, whatever confusion or fear he was facing, we would face it together. The air between us felt heavier now, not with awkwardness, but with the weight of things unsaid. His words lingered in my mind, his confusion, his vulnerability, the way his voice had trembled when he spoke. I wanted to help him, to ease the burden he seemed to be carrying, but I wasn't sure how. We sat in silence for a while, the faint hum of the lamp the only sound in the room. He shifted slightly beside me, his knee brushing against mine. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a ripple of awareness through me that I tried to ignore. "I feel like I'm stuck," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. "Like I'm not moving forward, but I can't go back either." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I turned to look at him, my heart aching at the conflict in his expression. "You're not stuck," I said softly. "You're just figuring things out. That's not easy, but it doesn't mean you're not moving forward." He met my gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something I couldn't quite name. "It's hard to believe that sometimes," he admitted. "I know it is, I said, my voice steady. But you don't have to do it alone. He nodded, his posture relaxing slightly as though my words had taken some of the weight off his shoulders. I don't know why I'd do without you, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The sincerity in his tone made my chest tighten, and I reached out to squeeze his arm gently. You don't have to find out, I replied, offering him a small smile. For a moment, the tension between us seemed to ease, and I felt a faint sense of relief. But then he shifted closer, his movements slow and deliberate, and the air between us changed again. I mean it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're the only one who's ever really been there for me. His words hung in the air, heavy and charged, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. There was something in his expression that made my pulse quicken, a vulnerability that was raw and unguarded, but also something deeper, something that made my heart race. I care about you too, I said finally, my voice soft but steady. More than you probably realize. He looked up at me then, his eyes wide and searching, and I felt my heart skip a beat at the intensity of his gaze. Do you really mean that? He asked, his voice barely audible. I do, I replied, my words laced with sincerity. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions, and I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, the way his knee brushed against mine again, lingering just a moment longer this time. I don't want to lose this, he said quietly, his gaze dropping to his hands. I don't want to lose you. You're not going to lose me, I said firmly, reaching out to place a hand on his arm. We'll figure this out together, no matter what. He nodded, his expression softening slightly, and I could see the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. Thanks, he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. You don't have to thank me, I replied gently. I'm always here for you. For a moment, the tension in the room seemed to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of understanding. His posture relaxed further, and he leaned back against the headboard, his gaze distant but calm. Sometimes I feel like I don't know who I am, he admitted after a while, his voice tinged with vulnerability. You're still figuring that out, I said softly, and that's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. I just don't want to mess things up, he said quietly. You won't, I reassured him. Whatever happens, we handle it together. The room fell into silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was a sense of calm now, a shared understanding that seemed to settle between us like a fragile truce. I could feel the weight of his emotions, but I could also see the faint glimmer of hope in his eyes, and it gave me a sense of relief. As the night stretched on, we continued to talk about everything and nothing, about his fears and his dreams, about the things that made him feel lost and the moments that made him feel alive. And as I listened, I realized just how much he had been holding back, how much he had needed someone to hear him, to understand him. But in the meantime, I knew something was coming. There was a certain tension that told both of us there was something coming. By the time we finally said goodnight, the heaviness in the air had lifted slightly, and I felt a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. He was still struggling, still searching for answers, but he wasn't doing it alone anymore. And as I made my way back to my room, I couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something deeper, something that would change us both in ways we couldn't yet imagine. But then the house was still that night, the kind of silence that felt alive, pulsing in the spaces between words and thoughts. I couldn't sleep, my mind too restless to find peace. I kept replaying our conversation, his raw vulnerability, and the quiet moments that had lingered between us. There was something unspoken there, something that felt fragile, yet undeniable, and it left me feeling both protective and uncertain. I found myself pacing the room, the soft hum of the ceiling fan, the only sound breaking the quiet. My thoughts were a tangled mess, circling around him and the emotions he'd laid bare. I wanted to help him, to be there for him, but I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing or if I even knew what the right thing was. Before I realized it, I was standing in the hallway outside his room. His door was slightly ajar, the faint glow of a lamp spilling into the hallway. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the wood as I debated whether to knock, but something in me pushed forward and I tapped lightly on the door. "Yeah," came his voice, soft but steady. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, his posture relaxed but his expression thoughtful. He looked up at me, his eyes meeting mine, and for a moment the air between us felt charged, as though the silence carried more weight than the words we could have spoken. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I shook my head, returning his smile. "Not really." "Same," he admitted, leaning back against the headboard. I crossed the room and sat beside him on the bed, the quiet hum of the lamp filling the space between us. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, my voice soft. "All of it," he admitted, turning to look at me, his expression unreadable. "You've been holding so much in," I said, "and I wish I'd seen it sooner." "It's not your fault," he said quickly, his voice earnest. "I didn't want anyone to see it. I thought I could handle it on my own." "But you don't have to," I said, my tone firm but gentle. "You don't have to carry this alone." He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands, which were clasped loosely in his lap. "I know," he said softly. "It's just hard to let people in sometimes, even you." His words made my chest tighten, and I reached out to place a reassuring hand on his arm. "You've been through a lot," I said gently. "It's okay to feel like this, but I'm here, always." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that made my breath catch. "You mean that, don't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I do," I replied, my own voice soft but steady. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions, and I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, the faint brush of his arm against mine as we sat in the quiet. There was something in the air between us, something that felt both comforting and electric, and it left me feeling unsteady in a way I couldn't quite name. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "You won't have to find out," I said softly, offering him a small smile. He returned the smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I feel like I'm always messing things up," he admitted. "You're not," I said firmly, my gaze steady. "You're figuring things out, and that's okay. It doesn't make you a failure. It makes you human." He nodded, his posture relaxing slightly as though my words had eased some of the weight he was carrying. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice laced with sincerity. "You don't have to thank me," I replied gently. The quiet stretched between us again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that felt full, as though the silence itself carried the weight of everything we couldn't say. I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and it brought a strange sense of calm. "I feel like I'm finally starting to understand myself," he said after a while, his voice thoughtful. "That's a good thing," I said softly. "It's not always easy, but it's worth it." He nodded, his gaze distant but calm. "Yeah, I think so too." We sat there for what felt like hours, the quiet hum of the lamp and the soft rustle of the curtains the only sounds in the room. I could feel the tension in my chest easing, replaced by a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in days. As the night stretched toward dawn, I found myself leaning back against the headboard, my shoulder brushing against his as we sat in the quiet. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it felt significant, as though it carried the weight of everything unspoken between us. "Thanks for being here," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Always," I replied, my own voice steady. Neither of us spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken words, shared glances, and the quiet understanding that something had shifted between us, something we couldn't quite name, but couldn't deny either. His shoulder brushed against mine again, a slight movement that felt heavier than it should have. I glanced over at him, taking in the way his profile was bathed in the golden light. His expression was soft, contemplative, but there was a tension in his posture that hinted at the emotions swirling beneath the surface. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," he said suddenly, his voice low, breaking the quiet. I turned to face him, my brows knitting together in concern. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. About everything, he admitted. About me, about what I'm feeling, about us. The weight of his words hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I can't pretend anymore, he said, his voice trembling. I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not. His admission made my chest ache, and I reached out instinctively, my hand finding his. You don't have to pretend, I said softly. Not with me. His gaze dropped to where our hands were now intertwined, and he let out a shaky breath. I'm scared, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Of losing you, he said, his voice breaking. Of messing this up, of ruining everything. You're the one constant in my life, and I don't want to do anything that could change that. His words made my heart ache, and I tightened my grip on his hand, hoping to offer some semblance of comfort. You're not going to lose me, I said firmly. No matter what, I'm here always. He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine as though trying to find reassurance in my words. Do you really mean that? He asked softly. I do, I replied, my voice steady. The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was filled with the weight of everything we couldn't say, everything we were afraid to acknowledge. I could feel the warmth of his hand in mine, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and it brought a strange sense of calm amidst the storm of emotions swirling within me. I've been thinking about that night, he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. What about it? I asked, my heart skipping a beat. About how much it meant to me, he admitted. I've never felt that close to anyone before, and it scares me. But at the same time, I can't stop thinking about it. His words sent a jolt through me, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I know it's complicated, he said quickly, his voice trembling. I know it's not something we can just ignore or move past, but I needed you to know how I feel. I needed you to know that you're the most important person in my life. His admission left me speechless, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The air between us was charged, thick with emotion, and I felt my heart racing as I tried to process what he was saying. This isn't easy for me either, I said finally, my voice soft but steady. But whatever you're feeling, whatever you're going through, we'll figure it out together. His gaze met mine, and I could see the faint glimmer of hope in his eyes, mingling with the vulnerability that had been there all along. Do you really mean that? He asked, his voice barely audible. I do, I replied, my words laced with sincerity. The quiet stretched between us, but wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that felt full, as though the silence itself carried the weight of everything we couldn't say. I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, the way his hand lingered in mine, and it brought a strange sense of peace. But then it happened. I don't know how, but all of a sudden, all the tension snapped. Maybe it was the sense of peace that came in or the look in his eyes, but I couldn't deny it anymore. I looked him in his eyes, and we both knew enough. We leaned in toward each other and kissed. Wow, that felt so good. After a minute, he pulled back. What are we doing, Uncle? He asked. I don't know, I replied without any doubt. But let's continue. He kissed me again, and eventually, he started to touch me at places I could never have imagined my nephew would touch me there. But it felt amazing. I think you know where it ended and what we did. I can't go into detail, but I can tell you that I hadn't expected that size for a 20-year-old. It felt amazing for a long time. No one could stop us. The world outside fading away as we remained in our small bubble of shared understanding. I didn't know what the future held or how we would navigate the complexities of our emotions. But I knew one thing for certain, we would face it together. And as I finally leaned back against the headboard, my hands still entwined with his, I felt a faint sense of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but we had taken the first step toward understanding, toward healing. In that moment, the weight of the night didn't feel so heavy. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that everything would be okay. Still, I don't know if it is okay, what I did with my nephew. What do you think? Is it okay or is it wrong? Let me know in the comments. It would really help me, and maybe then in the future, I can tell you even more about the story. Asterisk, thank you for watching. Asterisk, if you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more emotional, heartfelt LGBT stories. Don't forget to leave a comment below. Your thoughts and feedback mean the world to me.